we thank you very much for attending this session, which we think it is of importance. I would like to sincerely thank Gladden and Samir for inviting me here, and I hope that with the Budapest organization we'll find ways to work together in the months and years to come. We are the Delphi Economic Forum. We are based in Athens, Greece. We do a flagship event every April in the emblematic city of Delphi, but we have spin-off events in Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, Toronto, and a few more. So it is a privilege for me to chair today's panel discussion on a topic which I think is as timely as consequential. Bridge, player, or bystander, crafting a West-South economic impact. I think, without any doubt, we are at an inflection point in this global economic order, not to mention the inflection points we live in the three wars in Middle East, Africa, and Ukraine. The post-Cold War consensus, which was centered around open markets, multilateralism, and rules-based trade, is under immense strain. Of course, I must say that this post-war architecture was the one that brought us here, with the bads and the goods. So I think, in my view, we have to analyze what went back, what went wrong, and how we can improve the situation for the years ahead. And as we notice, rising rivalries among major powers have begun to fragment the global economy. Strategic competition somehow is bleeding into economic policy, giving rise to protectionist tariffs, industrial subsidies, and a rollback of trade norms we once took for granted. I think the global financial architecture, long dominant by few, is now contested ground. We see now the countries of the Global South are no longer merely passive recipients of economic flows or policy prescriptions. They are demanding a greater voice, a greater agency, and in some cases building parallel frameworks to finance trade, finance, and technology. So the questions before us today are simple and very urgent, but I don't know whether the answers are simple. In this shifting landscape between West and the Global South, shall we find common cause or shall we drift apart? Can we imagine a new compact and how this perhaps will be? Will countries, especially those in the Global South, can act as bridges across the geopolitical divides? Will they emerge as autonomous players, or will they, bystanders, be sidelined by great power? So with this, I think we can start our conversation. I was very much tempted. I have sent some questions to the excellent distinguished speakers, but I would like to ask with a very brief question, Andreas. Is the new global order in place? Are we in transition, or where we stand today? What is your take on this?
Thanks so much, Simeon, and let me start by telling you the truth, and I hate to break it to you. I think the liberal global order never existed. It has never existed. So the idea, was it a global order? Probably not, because it took us the financial crisis to include countries like Brazil, China, and India in the G20 in the systems of global governance. It took India's G20 presidency 2023 to include the African Union as a second player from Africa, with South Africa in the G20. In the case of the OECD, I mean, I took my A-levels in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, and Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history and about the New World Order. The end of history has not happened. We in the OECD, we took on board in 1995 the Czech Republic, in 1996 Hungary and Poland, in 2000 the Slovak Republic. We are now in accession processes with Brazil, Argentina, Peru in Latin America, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia in Europe, and more recently Thailand and Indonesia. And Thailand and Indonesia, both countries also seeking membership of the BRICS in parallel. So I think when it comes to global, the order did not exist, but what existed is a journey towards that order. Second question, was it a liberal order? It was a liberal order, or it is a liberal order if you define liberal as trade and investment leading to growth, growth leading to development, lifting more people out of poverty. This is the story about China. But it was not a liberal order when you look at, did we have rules for subsidies? Did we have rules for many aspects of the economic life? And our studies, we have a matrix database, for example, they show that only 3% of the companies on the globe, which we searched on, have never received any public subsidy. And 80% of the companies with most public subsidies are located in China. So there was not a liberal order per se. It was an order with some liberal aspects. And third and last question before I give it back to you, was there an order? And here again, my answer would be mixed. Because we had some rules. We had, after the failure of the GATT, we have created WTO in 1995, with China joining in 2001. So we had some rules for trade and investment. We had a plethora of bilateral investment treaties, investment agreement. There was never a global multilateral investment framework. We have no rules as said for subsidies. We had some countries who stick to an order. We had some others who define their own order. So in a way, the question is here again, we are on a journey to a playbook, to a rule book where everybody plays to the same rule. That's it. I leave it here.
Thank you, Andreas. Let me also ask you whether we can rebuild, if you like, trust and cooperation between West and South, beyond the traditional, advice that OECD does.
Yeah, I believe this is crucial, and I'm very much with the colleagues, with Sanjay and also with the lady from the BRICS. We need to build trust, and we need to kind of have partnerships on equal footing. That's why the G20 delivered some successful results, because people are looking eye to eye. And that's how we are currently changing the OECD, with countries coming from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from Southeast Asia. I'm embarking on a new cooperation wave with Africa, with country programs in Egypt and Morocco, soon in Kenya, Nigeria. So we need to build this new partnership. We need to build them on the basis of equal footing, and we need to listen to each other. This is very important, was also a message from the panel before. Also think about climate finance, about issues where we have a joint interest. Not in everything we will have shared values. We will maybe in the Western world not have the same values what the development in China have, but we have shared interests for cooperation, and we need to work on that.
Thank you. Szabolcs, to you. I understand you follow European affairs. Let us know about the global order, but also tell us about the European Union, whether you think it can be somehow rejuvenated to play a leading role in the world affairs.
Thank you so much for the question. Thank you so much for having me here. Excuse me for being an economist. Fortunately or unfortunately, you decide. My mindset is shaped by theories, terms, models. And when I'm thinking about, or when we are thinking about the liberal model, Immanuel Wallerstein comes to my mind. Basically, he was talking about the core, the periphery and semi-peripheries. The core is the place where there are innovations, and he went so far as to highlight that the core dominates the periphery. And we have seen many relationships like this on the world map, and they are still there, despite the fact that we have seen much trade liberalization. Countries trade much more than they used to trade. They are more open, but for certain reason, innovations are coming from a concentrated part of the world. I'm not saying that people don't have a business mindset. To be honest, I have just returned from Kenya, where I was teaching at the Kenyatta University, and in Kenya I always come to the conclusion that the Kenyans are very business-minded. Yes, that's the reason why I'm saying that. It is so good, but they don't have that environment which brings them to the top of the innovative world, to the top of the innovative countries. What we have seen in this liberal setting, we have seen the elephant curve. Certain countries benefiting from trade liberalization and globalization, certain other countries were not benefiting from that. And the field is very far from being equal. So I say that when we are thinking about, talking about the liberal order, we definitely need a kind of international relations, international trade perspective. It can give us a quite good understanding what we mean by liberalization and what we mean by the liberal order, or how it can change or how it will change. Much depends on much depends on to what is happening in the core countries. Our institute, we keep a close eye on Argentina, for example. Until the UK was a dominant trading partner, Argentina belonged to one of the richest countries in the world. In the 1860s, for example, after the Second World War, the stance changed towards Argentina, and the new superpower, the US, was not really willing to trade with that country. And everyone knows the example of Argentina. Argentina slided back, and now the country is trying to get back to the previous position. Yeah.
Szabolcs, we listened this morning to your foreign minister. He gave us his views about the world affairs, Europe, whatever. What is your opinion about, can Hungary become a kind of a bridge? What is the role of the Hungary today, in the European Union and, bridging West and South as well?
Well, the word bridge is good, I have to say. But we have to do more to have that exact bridge. Everywhere on earth, there are issues with the labor markets. Shortage of certain professionals. In some other countries, there is abundance of those professionals, but the bridges are not there. Also, there are bridges, but they should be stronger in case of trade relations as well. At our institute, we are against trade barriers and tariffs. And once they are there, the bridges are not there, or they will not be there. The chance is very important for the southern countries to develop their own products to be traded across the globe, and we have to help them with different programs. And once they are successful, everyone else can be successful. And when there are, for example, trade barriers, and when there are certain administrative burdens, the chance is not there, and the build is not going to be more visible, stronger. Instead, a shaky one, it will be a shaky one, or they will be shaky ones. And that's why I would say that basically with a better approach, we could build better bridges between the already developed and the emerging countries.
Thank you, Szabolcs. Let's turn to Sihoko, who lives in the United States, but she follows very closely what is happening in the Asia-Pacific. Am I right? Do we see an end of the globalization? Tell us a little bit also about the new global order, whatever it is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the story of the Indo-Pacific since the end of World War II has been that of growth. So in that respect, the international liberal order has been to the benefit of not just individual countries, but the region at large. But that said, there are three major challenges that are facing not just the Indo-Pacific, but also across the world, especially in the advanced economies. And the first challenge is that there is no strong proponent, an advocate, a leader that is promoting the continuation of the status quo and the current economic order. And that includes the countries that have benefited the most, and they are the United States and China. And in many respects, I see them as the opposite sides of the same coin. The United States established the rules of global growth over the past 7 to 8 decades. China has benefited the most by using and abusing that system. But both want to reset the system and change the game, because they believe that should the game continue on its current trajectory, their expansion, their leadership may actually falter. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is that of the middle powers, and that includes many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the European Union nations, including Hungary. And for these countries, trade is an integral part of their economic growth strategy. And isolation, inward-looking ways should not be, cannot be on the table. But they are, although these middle powers have a shared interest in continued trade facilitation, we are seeing that they're actually not united, and they are all acting alone in trying to achieve those goals. And I'm thinking in particular about the US tariff policy at the moment. And of course, we call that the tariff war, or tariff wars. And so despite the fact that countries like Japan and Korea, or Germany and France, or indeed Hungary, may have shared concerns about US tariff strategies, we are not seeing an alignment, a coordination amongst these countries to push back. Instead, each country is pushing back, fighting against the United States on an individual bilateral level vis-a-vis Washington. And then the third point that I want to make in terms of the challenges is that we are seeing an outsized role of the private sector. And so when we talk about things like economic security or the outlook for supply chain resiliency and innovation, yes, these depend greatly on government policy, but at the end of the day, the driving force of that is the private sector. And we also know that in the case of the United States, it's companies like GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. These are the companies that are making the United States great. But at the same time, how they are involved in policy making is very ad hoc. So how can we harness the innovation of the private sector? And of course, private sector companies that are so successful are by their very nature multinationals. And so they can play a great part in bridging that divide between concerns about the inequalities and the systemic challenges facing the current order and what kind of order we want to see moving forward. And if I may conclude, in the Indo-Pacific, we've already seen a reimagining of depending less on the United States when it comes to economic leadership. That's not necessarily the case on the defense front, but certainly we are seeing an Asia that is less willing to imagine less dependence on the United States. Can we see that actually being expanded? Are we going to see more economic partnerships and alliances, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but amongst individual Indo-Pacific countries with their European counterparts and beyond? Thanks.
Thank you, Shihoko. I think for the time being, the tariff situation is creating difficulties in the world economy. There's no doubt about it. It has weakened the dollar as well. My question is how bad this will affect in the short term the economies in your region, and whether you fear about these protectionism may create more problems in the long term. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the United States, it's not an economic issue, because the charts and graphs show that it is a negative, and institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank, have made clear that the tariffs are hurting not just global growth, but US growth as well. But the goal of the United States in the longer term is to have greater self-resiliency. Again, the United States is a country that is very geographically blessed. It's surrounded by two fairly benevolent neighbors and surrounded by the seas. And it can afford, in theory, to be less dependent on the global economies. But that said, the cost of living in the United States is rapidly rising. There is a great deal of disgruntlement, and I should also point out that the backlash against globalization is shared not just amongst the MAGA supporters, but it runs across party lines and across ethnic identities as well. There is great concern that there are people who are being left behind, and the tariff situation is simply a manifestation of a cry for help, essentially, to say that the current system cannot prevail.
Thank you. Kwame, to you, you are coming from a great continent with great potential. We thank you very much for being here with us. Tell us your views, how you see, the global affairs from the African point of view.
All right. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here. So first, I think the question about whether a liberal order existed or not has been almost flogged, right? If the liberal order existed, it would not be that easy to reverse. As we can tell, it's being fractured into different places with everybody interpreting all that. But I think compared to what the alternatives that are being imagined, certainly a more liberal order existed. So that's the first. And the second thing I'm most concerned with is, I think the insecurities that come with trying to redesign the liberal order come from the fact that we want to predetermine outcomes. And if you try to do that, being somebody with a tradition as an economist of classical liberal, I think the consequences will be bad. And speaking especially for those who come from the sub-Saharan African continent, I think some of us, not everybody, some of us feel that, look, just as the African countries, all 50 of them were coming to the door to start and, quote, claim the benefits of a liberal order, everybody's shutting down and saying it's not convenient for us. So there's a little bit of resentment regarding that. Of course, there are other people who also think that the alternative, based on who you choose, would be better. So that's basically the idea. But you can see that because of the shocks that have come, whether you would attribute it entirely to President Trump, and I don't think so, many people, and I have been one of those who observed multilateral institutions. I'm an incorrigible multilateralist, and therefore weeping for what's ending, even if it wasn't perfect. But one of the things that you saw is many African countries, to the extent that I can speak for them, all 51 of them, many African countries started to have reservations about multilateralism sometime in the mid-2000s, when what was supposed to be the Doha development round neither developed Doha, neither developed development, and obviously we started to see that, okay, I think for Europe, I say this with respect, for China and the bigger countries, for as long as these rules would involve some costs on adjustments from them, they were prepared to shut down everything and have everybody go home. So I was in Hong Kong and subsequently Nairobi and other places, and we saw, okay, I think we're just pushing forward, but obviously the total commitment to multilateralism, which is more liberal in my view than anything else, was already dead, and the rise of plurilaterals and all those became the idea. So if you see a couple of weeks back, and I think we have to be cautious about interpreting the problems of multilateralism and its shutdown entirely because of China. I think there's a lot of blame to flash around, right? But let's not do that for the time being. But in this, as you see, one of the things that's happened, it took the shock of tariffs rising for the Republic of China to announce a free trade agreement for Africa. And one might think that, okay, these are some of the right and bright lights of this, but I think the uncertainty that's coming into the future is such that nobody should be applauding anything yet. Nobody knows. A lot of things are in the air. And bilateral relations are going to be more difficult for small countries, small and open economies, most of which are in Africa, because negotiating one rule with the other, with every single country, with every single one, is going to be quite of a difficult one. So what I'll just say is that, yes, a completely liberal order did not exist, but it was far more liberal than what we are seeing as the alternatives. And secondly, there's a lot of blame to go around, but it doesn't matter now, right? 2 decades gone, I think we can push forward, and whatever comes, everybody will have to adjust. But those adjustments will be extremely difficult, and especially for small and open economies, most of which the African countries would be classified as such. Thank you.
Kwame, what are the major obstacles that you see, coming closer west with Africa these days?
Well, let's start with Europe, because we're in Europe. I think if you looked at the WTO as just one symbol of what multilateralism and the dreams of a liberal order were, for good or bad, many African countries thought that the Doha Development Round would actually see substantial liberalization of agriculture. And the difficulties politically and economically of those for the African continent, and most especially under the Common Agricultural Policy and all that. And the pressure, the domestic pressures for that agreement to remain and to become, let me say, a hill that European negotiators were prepared to die on, completely deflated many African countries about what it would be. So that's one, certainly. The second one is a reform of international financial architecture, right? People call it broadly. Again, they're bad ideas because everybody seems to think that we need to change, but not any change is better than what exists, but they're extremely bad ideas about that, on both sides, by the way. And I don't think that it's clear, in my view, that as you can see, there's a very serious debt problem, sovereign debt risk problem with many African countries, including the one in which I come. I don't think it's a liquidity problem as it's being suggested, but the ways for resolving for resolving sovereign solvency problems still remain. And no one's prepared to actually do something that's much better than simply talking about it. So we keep talking about it, and profiling better solutions than what exists to actually move forward is still part of the problem. So I think those two are bottlenecks. But the final one is that we talk about a liberal order. Coming from a classical liberal tradition as an economist as well, I think it should be unilateral liberalization. I know that's difficult politically to achieve anywhere and everywhere, but regardless of that, there are very strong constituencies on all sides, including on the African continent. If you look at it, one of the things that the recent round of tariffs have disclosed, African countries, which themselves have a lot of grievances about how quickly the WTO failed to unlock liberalization, have some of the highest tariffs globally and against each other. So there's a lot of political lessons to be learned here, and a lot of domestic work needs to be done before global public goods, so to speak, or before global trade relations are restored. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Emilian, welcome. You live in Poland. Yes, that's right. You have difficulties these days, but we'll see how things will develop.
Who doesn't?
But from birth, we are neighbors, I understand, yes. That's good news. You follow the Asian developments as well. You follow the Global South. Tell us, the Global South can navigate between dependency and autonomy in this kind of the world we're living?
Thanks, Simeon, for the question. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think I probably have to start with a similar qualification that I'm a IR theorist, so I come from the ivory tower of ideas and engaging with them. And I would agree with everyone what was already said. Indeed, we're living in these times of flux, and it's the unipolar moment, neoliberal or other, never existed. It was a myth to the extent that ever happened. We're moving towards this multipolarity, which we don't know what it means and how we're going to get there. And we're in this interregnum in between stage, which is chaotic. And that's where my theory language comes in to explain this relationship, is what me and my other colleagues call multi-order world, or for some of our friends from South Asia, probably familiar with Amitav Acharya's concept of multiplexity, a multiplex world order, where there are many players, many rules, and as Kwame just said, no referees. And there is no one to referee those relationships. And here, again, going to what Kwame and the other panelists have been saying, is some countries, actually every country in Global South, Global North, they've been trying to navigate that complexity of this multi-order world. And some have been doing it better than others because of various factors, structural, historical, political, economic, etc., location. And I think that's where I think the interesting thing of that moment for me is how to observing that navigation of that complexity of this multi-order world. And again, there are different examples. As Kwame was mentioning, perhaps in countries, some countries in Africa, that's not as easy as other countries. I'm more familiar, for instance, with countries in Central Asia who have been quite adept at, I would say, some of them, in navigating the multi-order world by committing or engaging with all the players at the same time. So I had last year an interview in Kazakhstan was saying we don't pick sides. We pick windows of opportunity and hope they stay open enough for long. So for me, this is what Kazakhstan and many countries in the Global South, and not just in the Global South, call multi-vector diplomacy, an attempt to look at, engage with those multiple actors at the same time. In our language, we call that hedging and balancing. We call those different strategies, but these are what's interesting for me in that setting. Some countries, because of location, because of capabilities, because of innovation, because of technological positionality in the global supply chains, they've been able to navigate that space far better than others. Again here, taking a step back in the current China-US trade war confrontation, for me this is very much, again, this is more optimistic reading here, that situation is very much a colleague of mine called it a déjà vu with chopsticks. You know, in academic circles, we say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So for me, what currently you're witnessing looks very much of a remix of a track I was listening to in the 1980s when was another Asian country was rising. And the reaction of the United States and Washington was very similar towards Japan. Trades, tariffs, Sony was the Huawei of the time, Toyota was the BYD of the time. So there were similar protests against concerns about national security, concerns of Japanese companies coming over and taking over jobs, the industrial implications for industrial policy in the US. And for me, the punchline is, what happened is, Japan survived, the United States survived. You know, the geoeconomics sometimes sounds scarier than the reality turns out to be. Of course, there was tension, but there was adaptation, negotiation. Toyota had to open a few plants in Kentucky, and we moved on. Life moved on. So I think for me, in that setting, history suggests that similar patterns of relations are not necessarily as dangerous as the hype of the moment seems to be. Again, we are based in Budapest here, so probably some of you know George Friedman, the founder, director of the Stratford, the futurologist, who was writing in the 1980s a book about the coming war with Japan. That by the end of the 1980s, the US, because of the supplanting and threat to US hegemony of economic rights and might of Japan, this is very much like what Graham Allison wrote in the Thucydides War, just now is the flag is different, it's China, but it's another Asian country. So for me here, I think we need to be a little bit, take a step back and take out from the hype of the moment and negotiate, listen to each other, and actually engage in conversations like these ones.
Since we live in Europe, can you tell us a little bit about the European Union? How you think, it will develop? Are you optimistic about the developments? Do you think that the Draghi report is going to have some influence or whatever?
I think the Draghi report, let's start from there. The Draghi report, it's actually positioned, so the Draghi report was about the lack of innovation in Europe and the lack of investment in innovation in Europe, which has been has a very long history and very complicated history here. And I think it has not, at least for the time being, I have not seen that it hasn't been heard well enough by both at Brussels or at national governments, at member states, countries. So for instance, the part that I'm a little bit, because of my research, is on digital dependence. We talk in Europe about strategic autonomy. Let's talk about that. And part of that strategic autonomy, increasingly these days, is because of the conflict in Ukraine, is about military power and military capabilities, and increasingly as what you were pointing about not just economic independence from the United States, but because of the current situation of security independence of the from the United States. However, and that's perhaps it's going to trickle down to innovation, perhaps it's going to trickle down through the European Green Deal as well, it's going to impact. But for me, in terms of this digital, in terms of when I talk about the digital technologies, Europe is increasingly dependent on platforms, as Shihoko was just pointing out, on the US, in terms of patents and technology in East Asia, and we have no innovation on the ground. So when we talk about, let's say, electric vehicles, and why Europe and securitization of Chinese electric vehicles, of course there are subsidies, as Andreas was mentioning, we all give subsidies to our countries. This is a hypocritical statement to make to our companies, and it's been a very long history of that. The global South countries, especially Africa, have been criticizing the West and the global North for that for a long time. We just refused to hear them, but now that it affects us, we're listening to it. But the issue here is that why we have not invested in innovation in those, and it's because of lobbying by German car companies who have been consistently resistant and relying to invest in those technologies because they have the market share. But now that that's threatened, that's where. So for me here, in terms of Europe has multiple fractures going on as well, multiple crises.
Thank you, Emilian. Thank you very much. Let's devote the next 10 minutes before we open the floor with a few questions. Andreas, would you like to comment anything about what it was said? You say things from, the eyes of 38, how many countries OECD has as members? Please.
I mean, maybe not so much from the perspective of 38 countries, but on the question, what is the challenge, let's say, for our generation? Okay. And I mean, the challenge remains how to shape globalization, how to shape a globalization that works for all, for most people in the North, in the South, but also within our countries, how to shape a globalization process that is not destroying the planet. And for this, I think it's important to think about what is globalization about. And I mean, this machine produced by a company, let's not to do advertisement for a moment, call it the banana company. The banana company is producing this little machine on which we are spending more time than with our wife and kids in a country called China. But it's also has 43 countries who are contributing with components to this. Now this company may move its production, its assembly to India, but still, it's a product which is a product of globalization. If this product was produced, if the banana company was forced to produce this product in the US, there are serious estimates that it would cost this unit $3,500 compared to $890 or $900 it costs now on the market. So I believe that the driving force and the current discussion on tariffs and how to manage trade should not deviate from us from thinking, how do we shape globalization? And this is something where I believe, or we believe in the OECD, that a rules-based international order, and I think, I mean, we all agree that we had some elements of it. Maybe some elements were not fair, and I'm not defending the European agriculture market policy towards Africa. So, I mean, there are elements in this rules-based order which were not up to speed, but we need to kind of develop together. And I mean, this means all of us in the room representing countries who are working in think tanks, working in international. We need to develop some standards, some rules of the game who will help us to navigate this globalization process. And we at the OECD, I just give you two examples and then I shut up. We have developed a global forum on artificial intelligence, where also India, South Africa is a member, where we try to define some standards, some rules for some principles for the human-centric use of artificial intelligence. So we need to think creatively together, how do we shape new technologies? Second point, we have developed international standards for taxation, so to make sure that individuals pay their fair share of taxation, also the rich people pay their fair share. This has led to additional revenues of 146 billion US dollars in all the world, and 46 billion of this in developing countries. So we are working together also with countries across the globe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, to make sure that everybody is paying its fair share. And this makes also the point that companies, big tech companies, are paying their fair share of taxation somewhere. So these are just two examples of, I think, where we need to go down the road further.
Andreas, one more word about enlarging your members, so you have more ideas and thoughts within the OECD about enlargement of the membership of the OECD. Can you tell us a little more about this, or?
About the larger members of the OECD?
About new members coming in, yes.
About new members coming in. Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, we are currently negotiating an accession process. More recently, it started with Indonesia and Thailand. Indonesia has just delivered a 1,000 pages initial memorandum where it sees where it stands towards OECD standards. So in the next decade, most likely we'll have Indonesia, Thailand as a member. We are negotiating also with Brazil, Argentina, Peru. We are open. We signed a program of work with South Africa. We kind of will have country programs with other African countries, maybe with Kenya, maybe with Nigeria. We will never be the United Nations, but we have the ambition, and we will never be a global organization, but we have the ambition that our standards and policies count on a global scale, so we need to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 members in each of the growing regions in the world, and this is what we did in Latin America and Southeast Asia, in Africa. So very much look forward. So
thank you, Andreas. Thank you. Zabulc, I think you have to say a few things.
Emilian, I think in your answer you mentioned dangerous relations as well. And something came to my mind, and well, this is going to be related to the liberal order tariffs as well. I think in the 1980s, the famous British economist Joan Robinson said that it is too bad when capitalists exploit other countries. But there is one more thing what is worse. This is when they don't exploit other countries. So actually it is fine when countries are trading with each other and they try their best in the liberal order. And I strongly agree that we need calculations and data, and we have to see how much would be the price without free trade, or without trade moving production from one location to the other. And well, we should decide what we want, whether to buy something from the neighboring country at a high price or from our own country at a high price, whether we want cheaper products giving employment for those who don't have employment at the moment, and making them belong to the group of middle class. And well, we need more rationality, and we have to treat the ideologies on rational grounds.
Thank you. Sihoko, we see a number of, how you call them this, trade agreements, between Indo-Pacific with other countries, how they support, the cases of partnerships, with the world. Can you comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, so the backlash against large trade agreements in the United States is nothing new. It really came to the forefront when President Trump was running for election the first time in 2016. And at that time, it was interesting because it was not just the Republicans and Donald Trump being against TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but it was also the Democrats as well. And so across the United States, there was this big backlash against big trade agreements that were seen to take advantage of the big market of the United States. So what happened at that time, after Trump won the first time around, there was an expectation that the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, would collapse. But instead, we saw the remaining 11 countries, with Japan playing a pivotal role in ensuring that this trade agreement not only came to the finish line, but that it continued to attract new members. And new members include the UK, but also both China and Taiwan have raised their hands. Ironically, Ukraine, too, has expressed interest in wanting to join the CPTPP. We've also seen using the example of Japan again, making a bilateral trade agreement with the UK soon after Britain left the European Union. We also see Japan having a bilateral trade agreement with the EU. We've seen China come up with big trade agreements, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. The list goes on. So on the one hand, we are talking about this backlash against globalization and free trade agreements in particular. But during this period, we've also seen tremendous appetite from other countries to increase their trade relations, to have greater formalized agreements, because what they want is stability and predictability and a focus on the rule of law. And I think that's what we really have to focus on, that it's not necessarily, when we talk about the liberal international order, that connotes a values as well as interest-focused framework. But when we talk about trade, it is values blind to a great extent. It's focused on specific interests and rules and norms and governance. And so this makes it easier for countries to work together, coordinate together, and have a point of reference to ensure that their expectations and the legality of their standing are protected. But I do want to point out to one thing. Again, there is backlash in many parts of the world about major trade agreements because it is seen as elitist, that it doesn't necessarily lead to grassroots growth, so that even if you do belong to a country that has a high GDP rate, it's not necessarily reflective of your own living standard or indeed the projection of your own growth trajectory moving forward. And that disillusionment is only going to intensify as we see the fourth industrial revolution with greater technology and AI in particular, which is not only hurting blue-collar jobs and manufacturing jobs, but also white-collar jobs as well. So we are in a very pivotal moment where we do need to have a greater understanding of what do we mean by growth.
Thank you, Sihoko. Thank you very much. Kwame, you do a lot of work for the sub-Saharan countries. Do we see any regional, cooperation among those countries that can play a more unified role in the world affairs?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if there's a continent that needs...
you have the CTA, am I right?
Yes, there's a continent that needs to show more confidence in multilateralism. I think it's Africa, because we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, 52 all countries going up there to try. Now, however, there's a good and bad. The bad part is they're trying to model like the EU, which is more concerned with domestic trade policy and stuff like that. That would be a disaster, I think. But on the whole, the confidence that they're showing in multilateralism is one that needs to be expanded. Regardless of what happens in the rest of the world, I think an open Africa is good for everybody else. So that's the first. And the second point, as I conclude, is, look, if you look at most African countries, when we talked about this liberal world order in 1995 and thereafter, for the average African country, growth has been less than 2% per year per annum. And so incomes have not grown very much, but one of the reasons why many African countries have better, on the whole, better outcomes today than before was because of global liberalization led to cheaper goods and more competition, which actually raised affordability for people. So that's not one thing we should throw the baby with the bathwater. So if there are any people, it might look odd, defending multilateralism, I think it's African people who have a good idea about multilateralism because they're just coming to the top of the queue. And even if the rest of you are losing confidence in it, I think people in Africa should still point you out and tell, look guys, I think you need to be a little more serious than you are. Thanks.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you. Emilian, do you see Global South as charting a truly independent course in the years to come, or?
Well, depends how you define the independence. I think it's autonomous, probably not, because no one really is autonomous in this globally interdependent, multi-order world. However, they're not trapped either. No one is trapped either. And I think it's not really, as Kwame was just mentioning, it's not really about aid, it's about agency and carving spaces and room for such agency. And I think that's what's interesting for me, what's happening in these different minilateral arrangements, alignments, and reactions to Trump's tariffs on the global economy and global countries around the world is actually this alternative spaces for agency that are emerging. And my final point here is, again, and going back to also like the role of private actors, we always talk about states and state actors, especially that we're currently in the current geopolitical conflict between the US and China. We talk about the Indo-Pacific, but we never look from the point of view of the oceans. We always look from the littoral countries. And when you look at the Indo-Pacific, who are the major players who actually route all the goods, and these are companies such as MSC, such as Evergreen, these are private actors. And these are the ones who are going to be the actors in any future geopolitical conflict or geoeconomic conflict. And yet they are absent from our conversation on that. And they're the ones who are facilitating trade. So neither American nor Chinese power is anything without the logistical networks that make goods and services flow across the oceans very much.
Emilian, thank you. We have almost 8 minutes to go. I would like to open the floor for any questions perhaps we may have. Yes, sir. Please, your name and the organization you represent.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Noć from the International Christian University and a visiting fellow at the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs. So I love the title. It's really interesting, but I think putting the Global South in one box highly complicates the idea of crafting a bridge. If we look at the Pacific Islands, and Emilian touched upon this, the Pacific Island needs are completely different than sub-Saharan Africa to Western Africa to India to Southeast Asia. So I'm wondering what the comments of some of our speakers are. Is there a better place to be talking? Is there a different way to be talking about building bridges? And Shihoko's from Japan. She knows about this well. When Japan engages with the Pacific Islands, it doesn't talk about a rules-based order. It talks about development in the environment and health. That is the needs of the Pacific Islands. So I'm wondering if we need a different formula. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take 2 more questions so that... Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Ayit Karasu from Duchas University. I'm a student of geopolitics. I have a question about the future of the capitalism. What will be the next stage of the capitalism? As Varoufakis pointed out, is it going to be the techno-feudalism, or as Professor Wallenstein pointed out, there will be a much more equal capitalist stage waiting for us? So what is the next stage? Post-welfare state again, or developmental capitalism again? I'm wondering your comments.
Thank you very much. I think the gentleman would like to have also a question.
Thank you very much. Anthony Dworkin from European Council on Foreign Relations. So we've spoken quite a lot about trade, but not so much about questions of debt and the international financial system, which are obviously quite topical. And I'm wondering, particularly this is for Andreas and Kwame, whether you see the South and the West coming together to create a viable way forward, or whether the divisions, the lack of trust and disagreement about representation are going to stand in the way. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Would you like to start?
Yep. I mean, this is probably stuff for another hour of conversation. So let me first take the first question very briefly. Of course, I mean, we did not speak about development. And of course, I mean, Pacific Islands, Sub-Saharan Africa countries need to have different strategy. I mean, we were speaking about what are the fundamentals for making this global South, global North, global West and South, what makes this work? And I think having a rules-based level playing field is the first step. And then on that basis, we need to connect ourselves with specific questions. And I mean, we are doing this in the context of financing for development at the moment, where we also look in very concrete measures in the Sevilla conference for developing countries to support development on the ground. Question on does it lead us to resurgence of capitalism or to something else? And here, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Margaret Thatcher, but you know, this TINA principle, there is no alternative. And I think the driving force of capitalism will always be there. We may like it or not. And I mean, my wife is also called Tina, so there is no alternative, so I know what I'm talking about when I'm speaking about the Tina principle. So we may, I mean, there is this driving force of capitalism which will be there, but I agree with you, and we have been doing some work on well-being, on what is prosperity for a country. This needs to complement it by other measures rather than just growth. So this is what we are doing. And very final point, and I've answered also the question, very important point, global debt, in particular for major emerging economies, for southern countries. We're working very hard in the G20 with this development of the Sustainable Debt Service Initiative, the DSSI. There is some progress, but it's also very complicated, sensitive issues, which requires many actors around the table, also institutional creditors. And I think this is, in terms of the micromanagement of the relationship, that is probably one of the most important issues, and you will see it also coming up.
Thank you, Andreas. I think Emilian has also some.
Yeah, just a couple of words only. Well, I'm in favor of international trade, but something must be confessed. The development of countries depends on what they export or what they can export. Once they are heavily engaged in agricultural products, low value added products, just because they don't have technology for improving the value added, they are going to remain less developed, underdeveloped, or emerging. And once they have technologies and they are capable of increasing the value added, they may develop faster. I don't want to chase you away with theories, but this is what the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis says. So, yeah, we have to take into consideration what countries try to export.
Thank you, Zabot.
Yeah, so just talking about what countries are asking for on the issue of development assistance, an anecdotal story that I want to share. I recently spoke with the chief strategy officer of Cook Islands. And Cook Islands, of course, is at the forefront of this geopolitical competition between China and the Western world. So that's how I look at these Pacific islands. But her argument was this, that when comes a thunderstorm or a hurricane across the islands, the first thing that goes is ropes, because the tin roofs fall off and people want to tie down their roofs. These are the realities that many of us, the IMF economists and the World Bank bankers and the like, do not understand unless we're on the ground. And I do think one of the things that Japan has excelled at is being very client-driven, that there is mutual respect and a focus on listening. And I think that should be an integral part of whatever development assistance strategy is put forward in the future.
Thank you very much. 10 seconds for you, and 10 seconds for Emilian.
Yes, the only thing that needs to the only thing that needs to change that's urgent in the international financial architecture is a common framework for debt resolution doesn't work. So I think we need a focus on growth sustainability as opposed to debt sustainability, because growth sustainability will take account of political economy constraints on the one side together with market constraints. Thanks.
Emilian.
And just very quickly, indeed, I agree with you. Like, diplomatic agility doesn't mean agency, doesn't mean autonomy, and context is everything in this situation. It's very contextual, both spatial and temporal context here. So indeed, Pacific Island needs are very different from Central Asian or Gulf states' positionality in that particular environment in which we find ourselves today in this multi-order world.
My ladies and gentlemen, it was my great honor to participate in this panel. Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending.